Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Forgotten Hockey Players of Broadway, a nostalgic look back at our favorite Rangers from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I'm Tom Browning, along with my co-host Rob Berger. We can be heard on Google Play, iHeartRadio, YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, and of course, our website at gotommyboyproductions.libsyn.com. That's gotommyboyproductions.libsyn.com. Please check it out. You can capture all of our episodes on our webpage. You can contact us by just clicking on the contact bar. You can leave a message. We'd love to hear from you. Love to hear about the players that you would like for us to profile. Love to hear about maybe some of the seasons other than the 60s, 70s, and 80s that really made an impact on you as a fan. Again, we will be going off the menu every once in a while. We'll be talking about the current day New York Rangers, the state of the franchise, and again, we love to talk about previous playoff games, impactful trades that took place in New York Rangers history. So wherever you listen to us, please hit subscribe. It's free. So without further ado, here are your hosts, Tom Browning and Rob Berger. Thanks for tuning in and welcome to another episode of the Forgotten Hockey Players of Broadway. I'm Tom Browning, along with my great friend and co-host Rob Berger. And we also have a special guest today, my son Mike Browning. Mike has done a lot of podcasting for KMBR out in San Francisco for the San Jose Sharks. So it's great to have Mike on the call today. Guys, how you guys doing?
I'm good. Good to be here.
Everything like the rest of us. I'm at home.
Yeah, that's true. Obviously, a lot's happened since the last show, and I have to apologize to the fans. We actually, Mike and Rob and I did broadcast about an hour-length show last time to review the NHL trade deadline, the moves the Rangers made and did not make. Unfortunately, we had a technical glitch that wiped out the entire show, so hopefully we'll get this right, or I'll get this right. Obviously, there's a new very important situation that has complicated a lot of things for everybody in life. Of course, the National Hockey League and the New York Rangers, and that's the coronavirus and COVID-19. And obviously, there's been consequences and implications that not only concern the New York Rangers, but sports in general. You know, we'll talk about that. I'll get Rob's opinion, Mike's opinion on where the NHL goes from here, what moves the Rangers may have to make now, if this screws anything up with their plans going forward. So I guess, guys, we'll start off maybe a very quick high-level overview on the Ranger moves right prior to, during the trade deadline, and if anything has changed because of the coronavirus, if anything has changed with some of the moves that they made. Mike, let's get started with you. Since you're out on the West Coast, you've got a feel for what's going on with the Sharks and the Western Conference, and obviously you're a big Ranger fan. So what are your thoughts about the Ranger moves and complications with the virus as it relates to some of those moves?
Well, it's funny when we were talking about the trade deadline and that podcast you mentioned earlier, no one could have foreseen that the season was probably not going to finish. There would be no Stanley Cup champion, and you got to feel for those teams that gave up prospects and other assets and draft picks for rental players who they'll never be able to use, and they're probably just gonna lose those assets for nothing. It's a horrible situation, especially for some of the smaller market teams who rely on some of this revenue. So you're probably going to see a huge decrease in the salary cap next year as a result. And I'm sure some of the financial situations for some of these teams is going to be pretty dire going forward. So it should be interesting to see how the league reacts to that. Especially the Sharks, who have a kind of a notoriously bad television deal and rely a lot on revenue and vendor sales at their arenas. So you're probably going to have to see some juggling and salary cap crunching from teams next year. And this is such an unprecedented situation. We don't know how it will shake out. But luckily for the Rangers, they didn't really, obviously as sellers, they didn't really have to worry about any of that. They picked up their first rounder for Brady Shea, and they also were able to pick up a young forward in Gauthier. So, this hopefully won't affect them too much. And as obviously a financial powerhouse, hopefully they won't be too affected by the virus at all, like some of these other teams will be.
Yeah, Rob, dovetailing what Mike was saying, what teams do you think are the most exposed to the ramifications of what Mike just talked about? And also, what are your thoughts on how this might affect the Rangers with some of the guys they may have to sign now or maybe weren't planning on signing, or just things in general?
I mean, I think the biggest hit is to a team like the Coyotes that were having a decent year, fighting for a wild card, have projected to have no cap space coming up next year. And then if the cap gets dropped, in addition to losing any revenue, that's just horrible for them. I think Carolina's in a similar situation as well. And like Mike said, the Rangers are in a great spot, right? They have cap space if the cap goes down. Huge market. There's so many questions that need to be addressed, though. I mean, do they call this season as it is? What does it mean for contracts, for bonuses, for service time, all that stuff? This is quite a mess, and I don't know how they can start the season before May. It's going to be tough.
Yeah, I'm not so sure they are. Brett Kougalis from the New York Post, and he thinks they're going to just wipe out the season. He thinks that that's probably the best way to go. And with that, they have to make some decisions on players like Tony DeAngelo and Ryan Strome. Maybe Strome would have been a guy that would have looked to trade, but now with the season, cut short, probably, are they going to now move Phil Petel maybe to the wing, which has been discussed, and they'll be forced to keep Strome, who I really like. You guys know how I feel about Ryan Strome. I think he's got 92 points now in 129 games with the Rangers. Been a tremendously consistent, effective forward since they got him back in January of I guess it was December, January from Edmonton last year. So, it's, they might be looking at players differently now. DeAngelo is going to be, I guess he's arbitration eligible. Is that right?
Yes.
Well, he is, but to Rob's point, what does this mean for service time? If they cancel the season, does it count as a season of service? Does it count as a year burned off your contract? I assume it will be, but these guys like Kreider, we just signed an extension, is that extension going to kick in next season, or is he still going to be on the cap for his old cap hit, which is, I think, $4.625 million. So I would assume that this would count as a year of service, but just the fact that they didn't finish the season is very strange. And then what does that mean for incentives? The guys who get a certain incentive for a certain level of production, obviously those things wouldn't be, they're playing 20 or so fewer games. So, I mean, it's just such an unprecedented situation, and there's just so much to figure out. So I'm sure the league offices, the front offices of each of these teams are scrambling to see what this all means. I mean, we don't even know if they're going to finish the season or not. I've heard an idea bandied about that they were just going to expand the playoff and do kind of like a play-in tournament with like 24 teams or something. So if that's the case, what would that mean for draft position? And honestly, just based on what you're hearing in the news with this thing, chances are the season will be canceled. I mean, I'm hearing that, this type of social distancing and isolation and sheltering in place advisory might last all summer, if not longer. So, it's just it is a mess, and there's so much to be decided and determined. And if they do finish the season, it'll be strange. It'll be like a 2 seasons in one, because they'll have a new training camp, then they'll finish the season. They'll have a tiny, maybe 6-week break, and then they'll start training camp for the following season, the 2020, 2021 season. So, who knows? I really don't know. It's crazy.
Yeah. I think maybe everybody should sacrifice equally. I mean, there are people losing their jobs here. Everyone is being asked to sacrifice. Why shouldn't that pertain also to the athlete, to the professional athlete? I think they probably will when it all's said and done. Like you said, Mike, the time frame on this is being extended every time you hear the news. So, I mean, why should I think the players have to give up something here. I mean, yeah, their incentives might be compromised, but everyone, this is a once in a lifetime situation, right? And I think they're just going to have to live and bear it, and just if they're going to lose some money, the players or the team's going to lose some money, so be it. Start fresh next September. Rob, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't know how you could do like a back-to-back like that. The best way to go is to just cancel this season. If anything, they're fortunate enough that they can start fresh with training camp and everything like that. Opposed to other sports like especially baseball right now. At least hockey got almost 75% of their season in.
Yeah.
I can't imagine the union will allow this not be a contract year. For the amount of time they play, they want to get their players to free agency as quickly as possible. There's no way the union's going to allow that to happen.
So, you don't think the union will just suck it up?
They'll want it to be they'll want it to count as a full season. You can cancel the season, but everything still counts. These games count, and these guys worked. And like I said, they want their DeAngelo to be an RFA next year. They don't want have them. They don't want a situation like in the 2005, the 04-05 season where contracts didn't count and things like that.
No, I
where
agree.
That discussion was available. So, that changes a lot of things for a lot. All of a sudden, where we thought teams were a few weeks ago changes.
Yeah. So, do you guys agree that maybe just end the season? Put the season in the books. Just put a little asterisk that there is no Stanley Cup champion awarded this particular year. The standings count. The draft position has been set. Just no playoffs. The season goes in the books just the way it is. All the stats are final. The only difference being they have not awarded the Stanley Cup. And then everyone starts a new season next year. Do you think that's the best way to go? Is that what you guys are saying, Mike?
Yeah, and I think that's the only way you can do it. It just seems so wrong not to have a champion at the end of the season, not to have a Stanley Cup, not to have closure after completing, I think, more than 75% of the season. It just seems like sacrilegious almost. You just can't wrap your mind around it. But if that's what it comes to, that's the best way to go, because these guys put in 3/4 of a year of service. These are unforeseen circumstances. You gotta, in my opinion, have it count as a year of service. And then the stats too. You have to count these stats, and these guys put in their blood, sweat, and tears, a full training camp, 3/4 of a season, and you can't just void the whole season. So I think it'll just be one of those weird, hopefully blips in the in NHL history where there just wasn't, everything was the same. There just wasn't a full season, and there wasn't a champion.
Yeah, Rob, your thoughts?
Yeah. We've had worse circumstances in recent memory of a season being wiped off the books for a much more childish reason.
Yep.
So
you're referring to you're referring to the player strikes, right?
Yeah, which ended careers. That's another topic. Is who people can retire now. Thornton has already come out and said he's coming back next year. I don't know how that'll stay. I'm quickly thinking about it in my head. I don't know what other big names we're planning on retiring this season. I think everybody will be coming back though for next year. Maybe a David Backes would be up there for retirement. I can't think of anybody else though.
Well, I mean, obviously, guys are not going to be as physically spent this year, obviously, because they would have lost 3 or 4 months of intense competition, which takes a toll on one's body. So you figure April, May, and June are the most vigorous and violent aspects of the league schedule, right? They won't have to endure that. So you're right. Maybe guys like Thornton and others who are contemplating retirement will give it a second look. They want to end their career on an upward note. But just getting back to the point before, I think the NHL has ended seasons before without identifying a champion, right? The strike seasons in the past, lockouts, they didn't name a Stanley Cup champion back then, correct?
1919, I think, was the last time besides the 05 season.
Okay. Well, what happened now in 05? That's right. They did do the playoffs in 05, didn't they?
No, the whole season was canceled.
The whole season was right. That's what I thought. Okay, so I mean, so
1918 was the last time. Was with the influenza in 1918.
Right.
But yeah, the whole 04-05 season was canceled.
Right.
Didn't play one game.
Right.
For reasons
So
that pale by
with the whole
comparison.
season canceled, the only difference in my opinion is like everyone saw that coming. It was something that everyone saw the strike on the horizon with the CBA coming to an end, and there being a lot of ill will between the players and owners. And then as training camp went by and what would have been the beginning of the season went by and that they were still at an impasse, I think everyone kind of just assumed, okay, this is not going to end well. And then they just eventually canceled the season, which was, horrible and childish and set the NHL back quite a ways, but it was foreseen. With this, it just came completely out of the blue. They played 3/4 of a season. And like I said before, we were talking about the trade deadline. Teams were trading picks and players for rentals to make a run at the playoffs, and fans were buying playoff tickets and stuff like that. And then it just comes to an end, and there's no champion. It's just bizarre. It just seems so wrong.
Yeah. Well, again, I think you have to put it in perspective, right? I mean, there are some people who 4 weeks ago had nary a worry about their careers, right? They had jobs and well-paying jobs and enjoying their careers, and now 4 weeks later, all of a sudden they're out of a job with no guarantee they're going to get it back. So I guess when you put that in perspective, I don't think these guys can complain too much. I think basically these guys are guaranteed for the most part. I mean, there will be some guys that will lose their jobs next year because maybe toward the end of their career or they're on the bubble and they didn't get a chance maybe to, distinguish themselves as they got closer to playoff time. But for the most part, they're well paid and they've got, they've got pretty decent careers still ahead of them, where a lot of people are now all of a sudden unemployed after 4 weeks ago everything was hunky dory. So I don't know. I think we're all in agreement. I think we should just cancel the season, put the asterisk in. There's no Stanley Cup champion, and then proceed with camp next September. We'll see where that takes us. Hopefully this will be behind us back then. Let's get back to the Rangers though on the trade deadline. What are your thoughts on re-signing Kreider, not moving fast? Obviously, D'Angelo's name was bantied about. He's still with the club. Brian Strome, there was rumors that he might be on the block, but I'm glad they kept him. What are your thoughts about some of the moves the Rangers made, and also some of the moves that they've made the last few days with Niles Lundqvist having a great season in Sweden? He is looks like he's ready for the AHL next year, and they got this big, strong kid out of Western Michigan, and Morgan Barron became ECAC Player of the Year in college, and he's a finalist for the Hobie Baker Award. So, it looks like they've got some promise coming up too. Rob, let's start with you.
Well, I brought up earlier in the year that they should be sellers on Strome. Whenever you have a guy going into an RFA season that's having the best year of his career, playing on a good line, and especially on a team that isn't going to be making a push for the playoffs, I felt they should be selling on him, and they still might. We'll see how the draft goes this year, how they're going to do that. And, kind of hard to think that far ahead the way the past week is gone, but, maybe they'll flip him there. A lot of years for Kreider. They'll be paying him through 2025, 2026. That's him and Panarin will still be getting paid. But the amount of money isn't a huge amount of money for him, especially if you look at the rest of the salaries on the club. The Brady Shea trade for a pick was, I think, the best move. Moving that pick, they now have 2 first-round picks in 2020 if they decide to keep that. One thing that we didn't talk about, to digress a bit, is what happens to all these conditional draft picks that were dependent on playoffs and playoff positioning and things like that. That'll be interesting to figure out too. But yeah, that's I've been an advocate of the Rangers not making a push this season, even though I know it's impossible because Dolan wants the playoff gate to make that, get those extra 2 home games. That being said, this isn't a team that I thought could make a big run this year.
Totally agree, Rob. I think there was way too much emphasis put on when they went on that run to making the playoffs. I mean, I see David Quinn's point, and John Davidson made a point of saying, players do learn, they grow when they're in a playoff race. I see there's some value there, but I just hope that didn't cloud their judgment when it came down to the trade deadline, and I think it did with Kreider. I agree with you. He's going to be 35, 36 years old. What are you getting with Kreider? Are you getting the guy that played the first half of the season, who really showed up virtually most nights for the first time in his entire career this year? And you can really, give a hand to David Quinn, I think, with that. He has gotten out of some of these guys like Tony DeAngelo, Kreider, Georgiev. He's gotten a lot out of these guys that in the past maybe, well, not so much Georgiev. He's a young kid who I think he's played well since they brought him up. But guys like DeAngelo and Kreider, and there's one or two other guys, Strome, who has really ascended, become an ascending player under David Quinn. I mean, I think he's done a great job in getting the most out of these guys. But is Kreider going to be the Kreider of the last 5 or 6 years, starting next September, or is he going to be the guy that played his heart out most of the year this year? And if he isn't, my God, that's going to be an incredible albatross of a contract when in 2 or 3 years. Yeah, I agree. I think there was probably way too much emphasis placed on competing this year. Mike, I think you had a little bit of a different take, if memory serves me correctly, or not.
Yeah, it seems so long ago when we last talked about this. The world was literally in a different place. But I think they were trying to, as John Davidson said and Jeff Gordon said around the deadline, they were trying to give these guys some experience at making a run for the playoffs. So I think that's where we mentioned the Rangers are in a good spot, but I think that's where the coronavirus effect kind of struck a little bit. If they knew it was coming, they probably would have gotten something for Jesper Fast or potentially even Georgiev but they decided to hang tight. But yeah, with Kreider, I think this team is about to turn a corner and to start to become a perennial contender to really grow. So, I think to keep at some point the Rangers needed to consider keeping the fabric of the team intact, and Kreider's a leader on this team, and he's a driver of play, and he's guys like him with his size and speed, even though he's not a 40 goal scorer, but the guys with his skill set are pretty rare. So, I agree that, it's a long contract, and some of the last few years of his contract, he might not be the same player he is now. But I think, these guys at the end of the day are a team of human beings, and leadership is important, and keeping some continuity and some of the guys that hold that fabric together are important. So I'm a fan of the deal. As far as Strome goes, I think with the salary cap likely going down perhaps dramatically next year, the decision will be made for the Rangers. He's going to be traded, and I think as Rob mentioned, they should have. I was always a fan of trading him anyway, because I think his production was artificially kind of inflated by playing with Panarin, who's an all-world playmaker. So kind of selling high on him and getting what you can for a 45-point player who's on pace for 70, 75 points this year is probably the way to go. And now with the salary cap going down, they're not going to be able to afford to pay him, his extension, which projections show will be between $5.5 and $7.5 million a season. So he'll probably be gone, and I think that's the right answer. He'll probably be traded at the draft, which, by the way, this year will probably just be absolute chaos because, as Rob mentioned again, what's going to happen with all these, conditional picks and these guys that traded, picks for players that, only played a few games, like rentals that only played a few games with them. Are they going to get compensatory picks from the NHL? And if so, where will those fall? Are these teams going to be forced to give the picks back? Who knows? So there's just so much to be determined before, the Rangers will know what to do this offseason. Luckily for them, I think, the Gauthier trade and the Brady Shea trade, those were more long-term trades for both sides. So, with Brady Shea, I think they did a good job of shedding some salary cap prior to the salary cap potentially plummeting. And for Carolina, they'll have Shea for the next few years. He wasn't a rental, so they don't have to worry about losing their pick for nothing.
Yeah, no, Yeah, I guess a lot of these conditional picks were tied into how deep some of these teams went in the playoffs, right? If they won Stanley Cups or if they got to the quarterfinals and stuff like that. I think you're right. It's going to be, who knows, I guess maybe arbitration may have to be brought in some of these situations. But just getting back to Strome, I think you guys really underrate this guy. Don't forget, Panarin's having his best season too. You keep on saying Strome is having a good year because of Panarin. Panarin's having his finest season. And don't forget, when Strome came with the club last year, he was their most effective, consistent forward for the amount of time he was on the team last year. Zibanejad was in and out of the lineup, and Strome really was very effective. And you just can't dismiss his play. I mean, if you watch the game with nuance, let the eye test, you see the guy's a good player. He's a David Quinn type player, and he's finally found it. I just don't know if you could just dismiss all that he's done, which is pretty, it's pretty substantial because of his play with Panarin. I mean, regardless, there's a chemistry there. I mean, you don't say, Taves is effective because of Kane or vice versa. And I mean, there's a lot of combination. Mike Bossy and Trottier. You never heard Mike Bossy say, well, people say, well, Bossy was effective because of Brian Trottier. I mean, these guys are good players, and the Rangers are not deep at center ice. They have very little in the farm system when it comes to center ice play. That's why they're still thinking about, according to a recent article I read, to have Phil Petel become a winger because he just hasn't been all that effective as a center iceman. Strome has been produced, so I would not be surprised, despite, Mike, you saying that they're going to have less salary cap next year. I would not be surprised that you have Strome, at least for the beginning part of next year. Whether they trade him at next year's trade deadline, I don't know. But, after Mika, who else do you have as a top-notch center iceman after Strome? I mean, there's nothing in the system right now.
You have to groom Hedl to be that guy. He's on an entry-level contract. He's big, he's strong, he's skilled. They drafted him in the first round, and he's done really nothing to disappoint. He's a natural center. He has the skill set. He's the guy that needs to be your center behind Mika if all things go well. I agree. I'm not saying Strome's a bad player. He's just not the player that a lot of people think he is. He's built up a big enough body of work to show what he really is. He's more of a 45-point player. He's not a 70-point player. Meanwhile, Panarin, leads the entire NHL in primary points, in even strength points. Possession numbers point to him just completely driving play with anybody with or without Strome. So I mean, every single piece of evidence points to Strome really getting a boost from Panarin and not vice versa. And then I think towards the end of the year, eye test wise at least, and you mentioned the eye test, you see Strome whiffing on a lot of just doorstep setups he's getting from Panarin, and that's fine. He's more of a third liner. He's not at the skill level of Panarin. He's a good player. He's a good third liner. You can plug him into the top six. He's going to work hard. I think his defense needs a little work, but you can plug him in with guys like Panarin, and I don't think it's going to be the optimal setup for the Rangers, but he's not going to torpedo a line, as you see. So he's versatile enough to go up and down the lineup, but he's just not as good as his boxcar stats indicate this year. And I think paying him what commensurately with those stats would be a huge mistake and would make Kreider's contract look like a bargain if you gave him what a 26-year-old 75 point center usually calls for on the open market. I think the Rangers would rue the day that they signed him to that deal. So, it's great that he had a good year. It's great that, he's a David Quinn type player, and, he's able to, not really torpedo his line. But at the end of the day, you have to get the value you can for him, which could be substantial, and make sure that you're not signing him to a new contract, because it would just be far too rich for what he really brings to the table.
Well, Rob, I guess the talk is he's going to be asking for 6. The Rangers are probably going to offer 4, and they feel that maybe they'll be able to settle for 5. But I guess that remains to be seen. What are your thoughts about Lundqvist? Has he played his last game as a Ranger if they do call the season? Is he done? Will he retire? Will the Rangers bring him back? Will he seek employment elsewhere? What are your thoughts?
Oh, that's a great question. I have no idea. I mean, I think this gives him the opportunity to retire. Now's the time to do it. It'd be perfect for him. But I don't know. Does he desperately want to come back? I mean, the Rangers aren't going to win the Stanley Cup next season.
No.
Unless something drastic changes. So why he would want to come back for another season? He's entrenched in the Manhattan scene, if you will, in New York.
Right.
Everything. So it's not like he'll have plenty to do to keep busy. He's coming off the worst season of his career, but he's unmovable. And we talked about this before. I mean, would they buy him out? It's a big albatross to have hanging over them for a while. It's a lot of money for a lot of years to hang over this team if they buy out or terminate Lundqvist.
Yeah, I think Gorton and Quinn would love for him to retire. I think they would just be aching for him to give them have a conference call sometime in June or July and say, listen, he's made up his mind, doesn't want to play anymore, because I don't think Quinn wants him on the team anymore. I think Quinn really likes Shesterkin and Georgiev as his two young goalies. I mean, it's almost become, when he plays, it's really to ride the bench, right? It's almost become ceremonial that when Shesterkin doesn't play and Georgiev does, it's Lundqvist who's become the DH, if you will, as far as sitting on the bench, because you never see Shesterkin and Georgiev suit up on the same day. It's almost out of courtesy to a fault that they're bringing in Lundqvist is on the bench, when in reality, if either Shesterkin or Georgiev get off to a poor start, just not having a good night, you can still salvage the game by the other youngster coming in and maybe coming back and winning the game. And I think they're just doing everything now based on political correctness, with Lundqvist and what he's meant to the team, both on and off the ice. So I think they would love to have him retire, and I think that's really the way to go. But if not, they can't truncate their progress with having him on the team next year. He doesn't bring any value to the team as a backup next year. He really does. He's not that good anymore. He just doesn't play. Whenever he plays, he doesn't play well. So, I don't know what they could do about eating a buyout. I don't know what the implications are with a smaller salary cap next year. Mike, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a tough situation with him. I mean, I think if this is the way that Henrik Lundqvist's career ended, it would be tragic.
Tragic?
Sure. One of the greatest players in Rangers history, the greatest goalie in Ranger history, the face of the franchise, and then just to be faded out and then have his last season just unceremoniously end because of the coronavirus thing. It would be, I mean, it's really, I mean, it's terrible. It's really terrible. But that's the way it looks like it's going to happen. And it's going to be a bad mark on the Rangers for years. But this is the way it unfolded, and I don't know how you can buy him out because of like I said, with the salary cap likely to go down next year, you really just can't buy him out. It just doesn't make financial sense. And I'm sure that Henrik Lundqvist, who's still an elite level goalie and proud, he'll want to play somewhere else. They want to keep playing.
Wait a minute.
So
I'm
sure they'll find a way to mutually terminate his contract or something like that.
Elite level. Tragic. I mean, those are the ways you're going to describe. You think he's an elite goalie right now?
Yeah, I mean, have you seen some of the goaltending in the NHL? I mean, the average goaltender in the NHL is bad. Henrik Lundqvist, you look at the stats, Henrik Lundqvist is top 5 in almost every goaltending statistic. And, I know he hasn't played that much, but yeah, he's still an elite level goalie. He's still Henrik Lundqvist. As good as he was. Henrik Lundqvist, I mean, and again, I know you don't believe this, but Henrik Lundqvist was the best goalie of all time, in my opinion. Oh. And all the stats support that.
Of all time for the
yeah.
Of all time for the Rangers, or all time all of hockey?
All time.
Oh
like
my!
If you give me one goalie to put in net for a game, it's him.
Holy
And
cow.
every stat, he's just an elite. He's an elite puck saver, and no one's ever done it better. You look at every advanced statistic. Henrik Lundqvist is the most talented goalie to ever play in the NHL.
Not in the playoffs, he wasn't. Not in the playoffs.
And you can say what you want about the teams he was on. You can say what you want about his clutch gene or whatever.
No, he doesn't have one. He doesn't have a clutch gene.
But I mean, he's won more elimination games in the playoffs than any other.
That's because he stinks in games 1 through 6. That's why there's game 7s.
Well,
I mean,
what, are you kidding? Jacques Plante, Terry. Wait.
You're not going to be on the right side of history with this one. I'm telling you right now.
Okay.
I mean, the teams that Henrik once more people start to embrace advanced stats, they'll look back and be like, wow, we really underrated Henrik Lundqvist. You look at the teams he was on. You look at those Tortorella teams where they didn't have anybody who would score more than 25 goals. They didn't have anybody who would score, more than 50 points. Brandon Dubinsky and Brian Callahan, glorified third liners were the most talented offensive players on that team. It just the level of talent that Henrik Lundqvist would drag into the playoffs and drag into the Eastern Conference Finals was just remarkable. I mean, if you look back at those bottom sixes, those third lines and fourth lines that the Rangers were icing at that point, and then compare them to the teams that they were playing against, it's laughable. It's like an AHL team versus an NHL team. And yet Henrik Lundqvist was able to make the Rangers compete and to make the Rangers, bring them to the playoffs. And it's a tragedy that he never won, and you can say that he could have done more, to win a Stanley Cup. But if you look at the body of evidence years from now, and you look back and you look at the stats, and you're able to kind of look at it with an objective mind, you will see the greatness of Henrik Lundqvist. And I hope, and it's a shame that some Ranger fans don't appreciate it now, but people will.
Rob, I think I have to go to my corner. I need smelling salts because I'm dazed right now. I'll hand it off to you, Rob, in a second and get your opinion, but I'll just name a few goalies: Ken Dryden, Tony Esposito, Jacques Plante, Terry Sawchuk, Rayner, George Vezina, Glenn Hall. That's just a smidgen. And then in more recent times, Billy Smith, Jerry Cheevers, Tim Thomas, Jonathan Quick. I mean, all of these guys have been outstanding, not only regular season goalies, but they were just incredibly strong money goaltenders. Jerry Cheevers is the only goaltender to make the Hall of Fame without being named to an All-Star team or winning the Vezina Trophy. But his numbers in the Stanley Cup Finals were just off the charts. He won a couple of cups. Billy Smith had an .894 save percentage and a .317 goals against average in his career, and an 88-36 record in the playoffs. He won 19 consecutive playoff series in a row, which will never be broken.
What that tells me?
And New York Islander
tells me it had nothing to do with goaltending.
And New York Islander players.
Exactly.
Come on. Billy Smith bailed out the Islanders an awful lot in games that they didn't show up to play. As a matter of fact, a couple players said, Billy Smith knew when to give up 5 goals and win, and knew when he had to be perfect and win. So, believe me. And Tim Thomas, was another one. Rob, what are your thoughts on Henrik Lundqvist being the greatest goalie of all time?
I don't know if I would say he's the greatest goaltender of all time, but I would say he's the greatest goaltender of the last 20 years, since Patrick Waugh retired, and talking about Juan Brodeur. Yeah. And it's very hard to call two things that are difficult. One, comparing goaltenders across generations, because or really comparing any player across a generation. Comparing, for example, a Gretzky to an Ovechkin isn't fair. They played in different eras against different players. You can take that back to Esposito and Mikita and so on. But one thing we know for sure is that goals against, save percentage, and wins are terrible statistics for evaluating a goaltender.
I agree.
They do not tell anything in the picture. And right now, one of the best stats that we have is expected goals against, save percentage. And those are goals that high quality shots. And Henrik Lundqvist's numbers are off the chart. You take the last 10 years, there's not one goaltender that comes even close to how good he was. And his playoff hockey isn't as bad as people remember, because what we tend to remember is a bad goal or a late goal. But that being said, over half his years, he had a goals against under 225 or goals against under 225. So it's not like he was keeping the Rangers out of games. He played on some really bad teams that were good because of him, which is different from Roy and Brodeur. Pardon me, with the exception of maybe Brodeur in 2012 in his final hurrah, when he got, which unfortunately for him ended up in just getting obliterated in Game 6 of the Cup final. But the tragedy in Lundqvist is that people will say, much like a Dan Marino, or actually better for hockey, a Marcel Dion, he never won a Stanley Cup, which has absolutely nothing to do with him. You put him on so many other teams, he's got 4 rings, easy.
No freaking way.
No
freaking way.
Sorry.
And that's it. That's it, Rob. That's it.
No goalie in the past 15 years has put their team in a better chance to succeed.
Let me say something for a second.
Yeah,
this is a guy.
I just think it's a shame that there's Ranger fans who they watch this guy play. They watch this guy be brilliant. They got to redefine the position on a nightly basis, and then they just come up with this narrative that he stinks. It's just, I don't know. I
didn't say he stinks, Mike. I've been watching hockey since 1961, all right? And I've seen Gump Morsley, Cesar Maniago play even before Eddie Jockman was playing. And I know these guys. By watching hockey, I know when a goalie has had an impact on the game. And I've seen Henrik Lundqvist lose to second and third string goaltenders, whether they play for the Montreal Canadiens and Tokarski or second string goaltenders with the Washington Capitals. I've seen him win some Game 7s, but only because he was outplayed in Games 1 through 6 against supposedly inferior goaltending. The guy has a losing record in the playoffs at 61 and 65 on some pretty good teams, maybe not the very best teams, but he played on Stanley Cup contending teams, and he's got a losing record. And I've seen him give up so many last freaking goals because he didn't have the will to shut the other team out, like a Jonathan Quick, for example, in that series, or some other goaltenders. I'm sorry. You can say whatever you want. The stats, on one hand, you guys say stats don't mean anything, but then you're talking about another stat, which is so esoteric to me that, I look at the games and I see how the game's played, how a goaltender sets or deflates momentum that a team has in the playoffs. And I'll tell you what, he does, as far as being a playoff goaltender, he is very average to me. I mean, you can say he's one of the best regular season goaltenders, and I probably can't argue about that. But his performance in the playoffs leaves a lot of Ranger fans, especially the older Ranger fans, wanting, because they've seen some great goaltending in the past where goaltenders didn't have the greatest stats, but when it came to playoff time, they shut everything down. And, and to use the word like tragic and, all this other stuff, it'd be for Lundqvist fans, I could see saying it's been a disappointing ending to his career, but to say it's tragic. How many cups has he won? I mean, what has he done for the Rangers where it's a tragic ending? The Rangers got 2 young goaltenders right now that look like they could be dominating the league in the next 5 to 10 years. So I don't know. I guess we'll have to agree.
Let's hope those guys do. Let's hope those 2 guys do. But I know that Rob has a hard stop coming up in about 5 minutes. I'll just say that from what you just said, you toed the party line almost perfectly of the old school hockey fan versus the new school hockey fan.
We played that pretty well.
Which is
Wait a minute. I like Jonathan Quick
for the content of the show.
No, I mentioned Tim Thomas. I mentioned Jonathan Quick. I mentioned you got how about Fleury over at Pittsburgh? I mean,
stop it.
Oh,
Fleury,
all right.
Fleury was was benched for the first cup or for his second cup in Pittsburgh, and the only reason he was on the ice for the third cup is because Matt Murray got hurt. That's not elite, especially when that was not at the end of his career. We're talking about 5 years ago now.
Yeah, I don't know. I think you guys are just making excuses, but anyway, you're right. I know you guys.
The Lundqvist tangent. The Lundqvist is the hot button the topic that will always make us go off into a tangent. But anyway, we'll have to do this again soon, and as the situation develops with the coronavirus, and reconvene and see where we're at, and maybe talk about what the Rangers will do next season if the season really is canceled or at the draft at least.
Rob, any final points? Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I hope everybody stays safe and healthy, and I hope we're playing hockey, and we got training camp in September.
Yep. Mike, any final thoughts?
Likewise.
All
Same
right.
here. Well said. Great talking to you guys as always.
Yep, and I want to thank Rob and Mike for contributing to, of course, Forgotten Hockey Players of Broadway. Look forward to our next podcast sometime in April. And again, Rob, we'll focus on a player, and we'll get back to what we've been doing and focusing on a player that maybe some of the Ranger fans have forgotten about, who really were appreciated when they played during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So thanks again, Rob. Thanks again, Mike. And on behalf of Rob and Mike, this is Tom Browning saying so long for the Forgotten Hockey Players of Broadway. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you for listening. This has been a Go Tommy Boy production.